Welcome to Behind the Green Screen. I'm meteorologist Anthony Yanez, joined by my friend and colleague,
meteorologist David Biggar. I know you wanted to say that.
Yes, I did, but you said it. That's okay. This is a brand new weather podcast, and so thank you for listening to this. Also, you can check this out by going to NBCLA's YouTube page. Now, from time to time, we talk about the weather, and we're on the green screen when you're watching us on NBCLA. But we get 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, and it's just not enough time to really get into really the deep issues of what is going on with our weather. And in particular for today, what is happening in California with these wildfires? I think the number one question is, and we'll start with David here, why are these things so huge? We're just the last 2 years. Let's not even look at the last 100 years, the last 10 years, since 1970, nothing. Just the last 2 years.
As weird as it sounds, I think it's all related to the rain that we had a couple of years ago. Because we had a good season, and usually that leads to a bunch of growth in grass and brush. And then you go through a couple of dry years, which is what we saw last year. And of course, what we have so far, we've had a bit of a slow start. And everything's dry again. Yeah. So now it's just all ready to burn really quickly. And so I think that's kind of what we had. When you look at like some of the top fires in that, there's a CAL FIRE list that we're always checking where it's like you've got the most destructive fires, the most deadly fires, and the largest fires. When you look at the largest fires list, they're often a couple of years, like 1 or 2 years right after a heavy rain season. So I'm thinking that there's some relationship that way.
And I think that's a good point, because when I moved here 4 years ago, we were really in the midst or the heart of that 5-year drought. And you know what we didn't have? We didn't have big fires. Why didn't we have big fires? Because we didn't have any fuel. And there's a meteorologist friend of mine named Joe Bastardi, and what he said last year, when we got all of that rain, when we got all that snow, he's like, watch out. He's like, California is going to have an awful wildfire season. And he said that months before everything broke out. And you know what he did this year again? In May, he said, I'm looking at the rain that's fallen in March. I'm looking at the rain that's fallen in April. He's like, watch out. You're going to see awful fires in California. And so he predicted, and a lot of meteorologists predicted and said, this is going to be bad because of exactly what you said. There's all this fuel.
Well, think of it like this way. If you kind of look at like kind of when our rain season ends, typically it ends kind of March to April or something like that. When it ends kind of helps determine how bad fire season is going to be. So if we get like a little bit of rain at the start of April and that's it, that's a little bit concerning. But if we start to get like a couple of remember a couple of years ago we had some rain in like July and stuff, that really helps because it kind of wets the fuel a little bit. Not enough to make it where it's not burnable, but it kind of helps ease the fire situation for a couple months. It's kind of one of those things where you want rain every couple of weeks. We don't get that out here because that's not really our climate. But if we had that, it would kind of help with the fuel moisture. But this year, man, it almost seemed like the rain just like shut off, and then we were just sitting there like, all right, ready for the next round. Oh, it's not coming. So that's the problem.
So we've established one element, and that's the rain, and that's the fuel. Let's talk about, I mean, it's really become the boogeyman in many respects, in that climate change. It gets blamed for California wildfires, and if you're Governor Jerry Brown, you're number one. You're saying this is all a direct relationship between climate change, and this is what's happening. Is it, well, we established one thing, that this is what it is, but is it also climate change?
That's a hard question to answer. I think part of it is, because I've gone through like some studies, and some studies say that for SoCal, it's a little bit more how we develop. I mean, you think of where houses keep getting built, right on what we call the urban wildland interface, which is where city meets wildland. So that's part of it. Northern California, though, the study said that it's a lot of kind of the overall warming of climate that has driven a lot of the drier fuels up in like the Sierra. So that's like part of it, but down here maybe not so much. So it's kind of this is the thing with like climate change. There's so much research going into it, and that's a good thing for it.
And if you want to look at climate change as simply as this, if you have a warmer climate, you get more evaporation. If you get more evaporation, you get drought. When you have drought, it leads to hotter temperatures. And so what you have is this vicious cycle. So I think it's a culprit. I think it plays a big role, but as you mentioned, it's not the only role, because we already established in point number one, a lot of this is fuel and when we get rain. And now to point number three, because you mentioned it just now, where are we building our houses? There's, if you follow me on Twitter, Anthony NBCLA, David NBCLA, I just put out 2 articles, and I thought both of them were really good and really balanced. One was from the New York Times, and one was from the LA Times. And it said you can't look at just one thing. You can't just blame climate change. You just can't blame, as President Trump will say, it's just the way we manage our forests. It's complicated, but he said, one of the articles said one thing that was incredible. It said, why are we letting people build a house here when they're so close to where fires have always burned? California has always had fires, and in fact, if you go back 100 years, they were larger back then because there wasn't any kind of fire suppression. They just burned. But why are we building our houses there?
Well, I think we're kind of running out of space as part of the thing. So I think that's part of the reason why, although I'm not a building or zoning expert in any way. But one of the challenges with thinking about like where we build houses is we have to kind of think more about like building with weather in mind. This has always been a thing around like the Gulf Coast.
Yeah.
When you build with hurricane standards. You try to think of floodplains just in case a hurricane was to come in or in case you get severe flooding. For us, we got to start thinking about kind of building with mudslides in mind, especially if we're in areas near burn scars. We got to think a lot about building with just fire in mind. When you build a neighborhood, you got to have defensible space around it. You want to have easy access. My parents' neighborhood up in Napa is kind of built up against the urban wildland interface as well. A lot of fire roads through the neighborhood to kind of give easy access to that. And I'm sure that's all mandated by like fire codes and stuff. But it's something we got to kind of consider when we're building.
And we're not the only ones that have this problem here in California. I lived in Houston, Texas, and I can't tell you how many times when a new neighborhood would come up, there would be people who would scream at the top of their lungs, why are you letting them build houses here when this is a floodplain? Why are you building a house here when you know it's vulnerable? Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but sometime, probably in the next 30 years, a hurricane is going to wipe this house out. Why are we doing that? And so I know one of the issues is we're running out of space, but also you really have to be aware of where you live. And I can't tell you how many times we've covered fires, and we're obviously covering the big ones right now. We've covered fires off and on throughout the fall. And we'll look at the helicopter shots. I'll look at the helicopter shots and I'll see there's a house and it's surrounded by trees. There's no 200 feet of defensible space.
It's tough because it's like you want kind of, good landscaping and all that. You want the shade and all that. You just got to keep in mind, you have to have defensible space around the houses. The firefighters in the Woolsey fire were saying that. It was just, there was so much happening that's like, that house, it's so tightly compacted with all these trees, vegetation, everything. It's like, we're going to try, but the house that's got a lot of space around it, they could easily set up fire breaks and be able to try to make a defense for that house.
I'm interested to see if anything changes after this, and I think the answer is no, but are we ever going to have some sort of, no, you can't build a house there? It's very un-American, but I mean, are we ever going to say, hey, that's a bad idea?
I think as long as we're considering like building codes, or at least thinking about where we're building stuff, I think we'll be okay, because at some point you just got to be able to build places. But we just have to always remember, there's always a chance of something happening here. So if you were to like build or buy a house on an urban wildland interface, it's one of those things you got to remember. Fire's a risk here. You got to have your go plan ready. Yep. You got to have defensible space, stuff like that. If you lived, let's just say in a floodplain, you got to have your go kit ready still. Let's always have a go kit ready wherever you are. And then be kind of, on top of any developments weather-wise that potentially could result in flooding. I mean, we all live in earthquake country. It's not like we're going to stop building houses because there's earthquakes. But as long as we kind of keep that in mind when we design houses and stuff where we have now earthquake codes, I think we'll be okay. It's just got to keep that in mind.
Yeah. I want to get to point number 4 here. So we've gone over fuel and when it rains. We've gone over climate change. We've gone over where we build our houses, but there is a 4th point, and the 4th point is fire suppression. I just got back from the fire lab in Missoula, Montana, where there's scientists that all they study is fire and wildland interface and all these things. But one of the interesting things was I talked to this fire historian, and he was just a wealth of information. Mark Finney's his name. And he was telling me how we started fire suppression the second we moved out west, more than 100 years ago. When there was a fire, we just moved here, we'd put it out. And then as we went through the 1920s, we came up with different rules, different laws. In the 60s, we came up with the 10 a.m. policy, which was our goal was to have every fire that starts out by 10 a.m. the next day. And so we've been suppressing fires for hundreds of years in one form or another. And so what happens is, when we were talking about the fuel, when you have an environment that has always thrived on fire, there's always been fires on the West Coast, always in the Western United States and in California. They've always moved out, and what fire does is it cleans all the fuel, the dead fuel out, so new life can come about. But what happens when that's not allowed to burn because we're putting it out, what happens is now all of a sudden you have this excess fuel, you get rain, and now all of a sudden you have these burning infernos that are just impossible to control.
But there's a balance to it. That's the thing.
Okay.
I did a study on this, or not really a full study, but it was like a little research project for one of my classes when I was at UC Davis getting my atmospheric science degree. And it had to deal with kind of fire suppression, because there's kind of a middle ground. You obviously, you devote every single resource to fighting the fire, like nonstop, constantly. You spend a lot of money. And you end up with tons of unburned area that needs to kind of naturally burn at some point. At the same time, if you don't do any fire suppression, as we see kind of when it gets into Forest Service land, because they like that kind of natural burning, as long as it's not threatening structures, they'll kind of let it burn a little bit of its course, you end up with large fires. So there's kind of an in-between of like the spending aspect of it, as well as the allowing some stuff to burn, kind of thinking ahead for the next couple of seasons. And so that was kind of the thing that I had looked into a little bit. And from what it shows, it's essentially you do some suppression, but you do the suppression needed to protect structures. You let it burn naturally in a couple of areas, as long as you can keep like protecting the things that need to be protected.
And I saw this. I was out in Malibu Hills on Friday when the Woolsey fire just was racing out to the Pacific Coast Highway, and a lot of the people, the neighbors there who were watching to see if their house was going to be okay, were telling me, they said in years past, they said there would have been planes that would have stopped this line, but they let the line go. And they said a couple things. They said, first of all, there's no houses immediately threatened, and they've got to protect all the houses in Malibu.
Yeah.
But they said, what they're changing now is they don't want that to burn for the next fire. They want to make sure that all burns because it's not a threat to anything. And until it gets close to some houses, they're not going to start putting out some fire lines. And I thought that was interesting, because I think we are changing how we do that. I think we've established basically the problem here in California of what's going on with the four things. We looked at fuel when it rains, we looked at climate change, we looked at how we build our houses, and also the fire suppression. But at this time of year, when you get Santa Ana winds, and I just don't know if people really understand that. Explain that wind.
So first of all, the Santa Ana wind, it's actually kind of interesting. This is like a little added point for a lot of people. So Santa Ana winds, we don't only get them in the fall, we also get them in the spring. It's kind of our transition season wind. We get them with what we call these inside slider kind of storms, where it's an area of low pressure. It doesn't bring us rainfall because it comes over the continent, so it means it's pretty dry. But it kind of just drops right by Nevada and then starts to work its way east. And when it does that, it kind of aligns everything just right, and we end up with offshore winds. So that's very common in the spring, very common in the fall. The difference with the fall and the spring is that the spring follows a wet season and is usually pretty wet. Fall has followed a lot of dry periods, so that's why it's always higher fire danger, and that's why a lot of people always talk about this being Santa Ana season, is because this is when we get it, and this is when they kind of think about it more linked to fires itself. Because if you think about just the Santa Ana wind in spring, we might call it a Santa Ana wind because as meteorologists, that's kind of the term that we use for offshore winds, but somebody at home might be like, this isn't a Santa Ana wind, there's not really high fire danger today. But the Santa Ana wind is for both seasons. Right. It's just that in the fall, that's almost completely tied to fire danger.
And a Santa Ana wind, it goes beyond meteorology, because you actually get into this compressional heating and the thermodynamics of the weather, and how basically when you get those winds that go to the top of a mountain or a canyon and they race down, how it dries everything out, how it'll come down and how the temperature will heat up as it's compressing. And we're seeing that really with these fires that are going on right now. And we talk about the fire triangle. Will you explain that and especially how that's affecting us right now?
Yes, we got a couple there's two different wildfire triangles. I'll try to remember them the best off the top of my head. Usually I've got a graphic behind me when I'm showing this. But one of them is fuel driven. You need fuel, oxygen, and topography, if I remember correctly, I think. I have the two fire triangles behind me. So
yeah, that's right. I'm trying
Yeah,
to, I know, 'cause usually we're looking at it.
wildfire requires topography. That's the key thing because, wildfires grow really rapidly when you have steep terrain. So that's part of it. You also need a little bit of heat, and you need just kind of the right weather conditions as part of I think the wildland one. The other one definitely is fuel, oxygen, and you get those two things that combine, and you can get really...
Fuel, oxygen, topography. That's what the one was, yeah. Yep.
See, good.
Yes,
We're piecing it together slowly.
Yes. I think we hear this a lot, and I think a lot of times it's actually misused, but you hear fire creates its own weather. So when there is a fire that starts, I'm going to ask you this, but I thought this was fascinating. When I went to the fire lab, they showed how simple this is. And what they did was they put together 4 fires. So there was a plank on one side, a plank here, and a plank here, and a small plank in the middle. They coated all of them with alcohol. They lit all 4 on fire, and the winds were just as calm as they are in this room. And what you saw was how each fire interacted with each other. So they all pulled in oxygen, and the middle fire created a fire whirl. It's the most fascinating thing because what happened was they all competed for this oxygen as they pulled in the middle because the fires were around it. It created a fire whirl, and that one in the middle was 20 feet high, and every other fire with no wind in the room all bent down. All the flames bent to lean to that middle one. There was no wind, it created its own wind. So even in a controlled environment, every fire creates its own weather, but when you get these massive fires...
Yeah, it's something you got to kind of think about. Think about how fire's working. It's burning something, usually something that's carbon-based, so sort of like wood, for example, or brush, and it's combining oxygen. It has to burn the oxygen in order to do this. So what happens is now you're creating almost kind of like a vacuum, so to speak. Well, you can't just have no oxygen in a space. Oxygen's going to rush in.
Right.
And so when it does that, it just keeps feeding the fire. And so that will cause kind of almost its own wind coming in because oxygen's got to come from somewhere, so it's going to move stuff with it. And so that's kind of why we see sometimes, we may be seeing wind blowing in a specific direction, but we can look at the fire and it's kind of like leaning the other way or leaning sideways or something because it's kind of got its own little elements down at the surface. I kind of explained this when we were doing some of our coverage the other night. The best I can think of it explaining it is when you're looking at the observations that we show you, like the winds are coming out of the northeast 10 miles an hour. That's a very broad observation. It's kind of looking at the overall picture. If you wanted to get down and look at what the actual fire itself is doing right by the fire, it's a very small scale thing, and you'd have to almost have a weather instrument hold right by the fire in order to see that. You can't necessarily see it on the wider scale of things.
And that's one of the problems with fire forecasting, in that in a hurricane, you get these planes that'll fly right into the eye. It's a little turbulent in the eye wall. The eye is perfectly smooth. It gets turbulent again as you go through the other eye wall, but you can get really good readings of a hurricane. Tornadoes, the radar advancements on tornadoes is astounding, but in a fire, you got a helicopter, you can't see what's going on under that smoke. The firefighters obviously aren't under that smoke. Who knows what's going on under that smoke?
And how are you supposed to forecast the individual little bits of brush and everything like that? It may run into a section of brush that's very high in oil content or very tall, and the flame lengths go about 3 times taller than brush will. So if you've got like 10 feet of brush, you could get 30 feet of flames. How are you supposed to know that that's coming? Because maybe the fire you think is burning in a different direction. But as you mentioned, if you can't see it through the smoke, there might be an additional fire behind the actual front section of the fire that you see burning through the area, and that could be doing something completely different that you're not expecting. And
I will say that these scientists I talked to in Missoula, they're working on a new fire model that's going to help firefighters and meteorologists. It's set to come out in 2020. And what they said was for the firefighters who've died in fires, there's enough information now out there to where they think they can protect them now, because many times they're in an area and it's like, oh, I'm safe, I'm good. And then I think people, unless you, and I think people, especially in these fires that are burning now, unless you're there, when they tell you to evacuate and you're like, oh, I've got time, and then 5 minutes later, it's there.
Well, think of Jonathan. Jonathan Gonzalez, one of our reporters, was out on a ridge line, and he told me that the fire was not burning in their direction. It was burning across, it was going down the canyon, then up the next canyon wall. And he said, then we got a slight wind shift, and 5 minutes later, where he was standing was completely on fire. And so they had seen suddenly that it was coming toward them, and they got in the truck and drove away. But he was stunned at how fast it moved. And part of the thing is, you may think that you're a good distance away, But you got to keep in mind that fire can change speed depending on topography. For every 10 degrees of slope, it doubles in speed. So if that fire is initially just coming at you at only about, let's just say 5 miles an hour, that's about the top end on flat ground, it suddenly gets to a slope, it might be coming at you at 10, 15 miles an hour. So you thought initially, I've got so much time, but now you've got a lot less time. This is why, again, and I'll keep emphasizing this, go kit, have a go bag, like your basic items, your prescriptions, your IDs, your passports, all that. That way, if you're ever asked to evacuate, you can just do it like that.
Yeah. And also, listen, when you're in an evacuation zone, they tell you to evacuate, you got to go immediately. I know a lot of people say, no, 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 they're over-warning, they just want us to get out. So it's, no, they want you to get out to save your life. And sometimes if you wait too long, you hit that traffic and you're stuck. And it's the consequences are dire. And I know psychologically, I think what happens with a lot of us is we think it can never happen to us. You know, it's never burned here. I've lived here for 20 years, or for some of the people I met in Malibu, I've lived here for 40 years, and you just get comfortable, and you're like, it's never going to happen to me, but sometimes it happens to you.
Yeah, and I mean, evacuate, not only to save yourself, but also to help the firefighters out and the police out. Their job is to get in there and to protect your house, your neighbor's house, and try to stop the advancement of the fire. It's hard for them to do that when there's people driving around, when roads are clogged, and when they have to actually go get people out of homes because they're still inside. I mean, that's the last thing I think that firefighters want. I mean, granted, I'm not a firefighter, but I think the last thing they want is to have to be called to a 911 call of somebody who's saying, help, I'm trapped in an evacuation area. They'll go out and they'll try to save you. But it's one of those things where it's like there's so many things going on that it would be one more thing added to the firefighters' plate.
And you know, and just coming from an area that forecasted hurricanes, it's the same thing. It's like, listen, we're telling you to evacuate now. And with hurricanes, you get 2 to 3 days sometimes to evacuate instead of 20 to 30 minutes. But it's like, listen, if you stay, we can't help you. We can't get back here for another day or two. So you're taking your life in your own hands, and sometimes that's deadly. Jeremy, do we still have time? Are we good still on time?
Yeah, you can go to next.
Okay. Hey, what you may not know is David Biggar here is meteorologist extraordinaire because he's also a pilot. So he not only knows the weather and here's what's going on the green screen, here's what you can expect tomorrow, but I mean, you know a totally different part of meteorology, which of course is the aviation meteorology. So how, knowing that, does that help you kind of see and forecast and talk about what's happening with the fire on the air?
Well, it's a little bit of kind of knowing the terrain and topography. I've flown over all the Santa Monica Mountains before, so it's like I know that area that was on fire. But at the same time, it's also the aerial firefight. The thing that still to this day just mesmerizes me is just watching them fight fires from the air. I mean, it's stunning. We have giant former passenger aircraft that have been converted over to tankers. And I think about I fly only small planes. I don't fly jets, but I think about just the controllability of a small aircraft. And then I'm thinking of, wow, they're flying this aircraft that used to do transatlantic flights, and they're doing tight maneuvers around fires. It's incredible to watch. Very skilled pilots involved in aerial firefighting, and it's interesting to watch just kind of the whole procedure that they go through with the spot aircraft followed by the tanker drop, and then at the same time there's kind of almost, I won't call them an incident commander, so to speak, because that's on the ground, but it's almost like they have like an incident commander that's flying up there that's kind of looking down like, that's an area that we need to set up a line over there. Telling the spotter aircraft, he's then trying to line it up. It's fascinating to watch.
I'd never seen that until Friday when I went out to Malibu with the Woolsey fire, and you see that top plane that's higher than every other plane that just circles. And then you have the spot plane, it lets out a little poof of, and a lot of people think, oh, look, it's laying down some retardant. No, it's actually, that's the path for the big DC-10. And it's amazing, as you were mentioning, to be eye level, because usually when you see the helicopter shots of the retardant drops, the Phos-Chek drops, you're looking at it from the helicopter looking down at the plane. But when you're eye level with that plane, again, you're looking at a DC-10 that's coming down close to the ground in the mountains. So, and there's fire. So it actually, I saw a few times where the DC-10 followed the line. It's like, and here's where I need to drop. It's dropping in the smoke. So first of all, I can't imagine being a pilot and losing visibility like that.
It's terrifying.
And then knowing, I got to pull up here after I lay my FOS check drop and get out. And the precision was amazing, but I tell you, I couldn't believe how low they got, and I couldn't believe how there were times that they lost visibility, or it looked like they lost visibility because they flew right into the smoke, laid down the retardant and got out, and I'm like, how did they do that without hitting the mountain?
Yeah, so that's part of the job of the spotter aircraft, is kind of assessing a safe path for them to go. But yeah, you were mentioning it lets out a little puff of smoke. There's a video from the California National Guard from the Carr fire, I think it was a couple months ago, up in Northern California. And it's a C-130 that's doing a FOS check drop. And you can see the spotter plane off in the distance. You just see the flashing lights of the strobes on the wings. And then you see the puff of smoke. And what they do is they're trying to aim to get right into the middle of that puff. And then as soon as they hit it, you hear the sound of all the retardant being released out of the back. So it's amazing to watch.
What do you think we can anticipate moving forward? Because honestly, we've had 2 awful, awful years of fires, and we're speaking just specifically California since we're here in Los Angeles. You have these issues with climate change, fire suppression. You have building codes and how we build houses. What's going to happen? I mean, we're eventually going to get to some rain here in the wet season. We're eventually going to get into the winter where temperatures are going to be pretty cold for us. And then we're going to look back. What's going to change? What's going to happen? What should happen?
Well, I'll relate it to something kind of aviation related. And this is just kind of a reality, and it's kind of a bit of a sad reality, but this is just how it works in aviation. In order to fix problems that we find with aircraft or in aviation in general, an accident usually has to happen. And then you learn from that. And so you can almost think of this as kind of something that we have to learn from. And so, I mean, they're still fighting the fire right now, but I'm sure they're going to do a whole big debrief on this, try to figure out, like, first, what was the cause of it? How could we have better defended things? How could people have better responded? How can we better design homes? And so I think they'll come out with something, but I'm really hoping that, you know, the kind of activity that we've seen, we kind of come up with better ways maybe of warning people. In the case of like Paradise, California, this is obviously still very much happening with this fire. There's a lot of people that said like, hey, we had absolutely no warning. They're out kind of in a rural area. Maybe it wasn't great cell reception. Maybe the power went out. Do we have a better way of relaying a message to people? So I think there's going to be a whole discussion about that. It's kind of like after the Napa earthquake, how we all had a discussion about the earthquake early warning system. It's like, well, we've been kind of testing out. Maybe we should actually develop one.
So and it's almost here.
Fortunately, it usually takes some sort of an event to kind of kickstart us into doing something. So hopefully these fires will be the start of something. I mean, they're so sad, but hopefully they'll be the start of something good development-wise in the future that will help us in the event of this happening again.
And I'm usually an optimist, but I'm so much more pessimistic on something like this because I just think you have a lot of people really yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs about here's what the problem is and not getting to solutions. That blaming climate change or blaming fire suppression and saying, okay, well, what are we going to do for our communities? On the local level, how are we going to keep our families and our homes safe? So I don't know. I don't see, I'm not really optimistic on that end right now because I just don't see us coming together and saying, who cares? But I think it's an important thing to care about, but who cares? Let's figure out, like you say, how do we keep our homes and our families safe? I thought that was a good point. And you know what else we haven't even mentioned is think about 100 years ago when a fire started in California. It was from a campfire or a lightning strike. How many of these fires are from because we're building in these areas or from electrical?
Well, there's some of that aspect, but I think if you kind of look at it more kind of broad cause, think of it this way. Rather than saying electrical, how many are just human caused?
Yes.
That's the way to look at it.
Because
we always talk about wildland fires. We always go like, oh, it was possibly caused by a lightning strike. So few fires are caused by lightning strikes. Granted, we get thunderstorms over the mountains and stuff like that. We do generate a lot of fires, but they usually go out because of the rain in the area or something like that. Sometimes with dry lightning, which is always concerning for us, we do develop fires. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, lightning-started fires are a very small percentage of the fires in California, especially the destructive fires. because usually those are somehow human caused, and it's usually already close to a human population. If you have a lightning strike out in the middle of nowhere in the area mountains, it may not, by the time the fire develops into something, it may not get anywhere near homes, compared to a fire that is only a few hundred feet from homes to start. So that's kind of the interesting thing. We have to keep that in mind as people, that we could cause fires, and that's the main cause in California.
Yep. And 60 years ago, 50% of our fires were from lightning strikes.
It's definitely not that anymore. It's
No.
a lot lower.
Yeah, that was a great point. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. If you have questions about fires on the podcast, you can find David and I on social media. David, NBCLA. I'm Anthony, NBCLA. We are happy to answer any of your fire questions or any of your forecasting questions. Now, there's going to be a video version of this on YouTube, so subscribe to NBCLA's YouTube channel. We also have some reports and some really cool stories. I did a lot of stories on climate change and things happening with our oceans here in Southern California that you can check out. And you can, if you don't have it yet, download the NBCLA app. For David Biggar and I, thank you for joining us.